Oculus by Eerily. Chapter 2. The Circle. His limbs felt chilled like he'd just been shoved into a freezer. His body felt suspended in a fixed place in time. He could move and jerk about, but never make contact with anything. He could open his eyes, but saw only a brownish-black gradient of an abyss. His body was floating in a void. Every part of him yearned for warmth as he struggled to breathe in. As he kicked and thrashed, he heard familiar sounds. It was a muddy and distorted sloshing. It was then he realized, not only was he floating, but also wet. Panic set in when he finally gasped, only to be met with a throat full of ice-cold water. He moved closer to the bright brown beams of color. Despite this, he knew he wouldn't make it to the surface conscious. In the moment he had that terrible revelation, a large pair of hands broke through the shining rays of ripples. His heart leapt out of his chest with relief. They grabbed his wrist. He joyously expected to be heaved up out of the dark pit, but his rejoice soon gave way into horrified shock. Those hands tightly wound themselves around his throat, and then pressed him back down deeper into the water. He was so close to the surface. He could see distorted colors dancing in the chaos of the water. In fact, he could almost make out the face of his attacker. Almost. He gasped in a painful mouthful of water, which proved his undoing. His vision blurred, and his lungs burned like hot iron against his insides. His body lurched in his sheets. He took in another gasp for air, and thankfully, his lungs filled with it. "Oh, Jesus! Oh, Christ!" Tweek cried out. Ripples of relief wadded through his flesh when he realized he was in his room. However, the happiness didn't last long. Yet again, that same terrible dream left him awake and shaking in his bed. Sleep was impossible ever since Craig snuck into the window a week prior. His dreams were plagued by nightmares. Nightmares that left him so petrified, he tried to avoid sleep altogether. Not that he got very much of it beforehand. He missed a lot of school because of it. Despite his fear of sleep, he took to lying in bed for hours on end. Hours on end with no interruptions from David, the man in the attic, oddly enough. Maybe David's absence had something to do with the breathing that still lingered in the air. That heavy, throaty breathing. He heard it all the time, as if Craig was still clawing away at the underbelly of his bed. However, there was nothing there. He rubbed his forehead with small hands, and took to chanting about how much pressure it all was. It was the only thing the child could do to spare himself from violent sobbing. He'd been crying a lot that week. Usually, his mother would hear and come into his room. She'd sit with him and sing his favorite lullaby, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That particular night, though, he was alone. His parents were sleeping soundly in their room down the hall. He knew for sure no one would hear him, so he let it come bubbling out. His eyes became wet. His pillowcase did too. The tiny muscle thumping in his chest was breaking. He felt so isolated, and he was still missing Craig. He tried, and tried so hard to find him. He looked through the closet, under his bed, and even went up in the attic in hopes of coming across him. However, all he found were a few old pairs of socks and an oddly spooked David. There was no Craig. Not anywhere, despite the fact that Tweek could still occasionally hear his labored breathing. A sob broke out of him. He pressed his face hard into the fluff of his pillow to conceal his wretched wailing. It all just hurt so badly. Too badly. It was then an odd sound cut through his cries. A disembodied murmuring floated through the room. The faint sound let centipedes loose under Tweek's skin. It was humming. just like the heavy breathing that plagued his bed. It didn't seem to have a source. It mimicked the tune his mother would sing when she'd caught him crying, though it most definitely did not sound like her. It was quivering and small, but shrill like nails scraping against a chalkboard. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Rain as thick as black oil pounded on their heads. The soles of their shoes sank deep into the wet ground. Lightning cracked across the black sky, and thunder roared like an ancient behemoth. They knew it'd be raining, but they hadn't expected such a storm. Still, thanks to Kyle's stubbornness, he and Kenny made their way towards the rendezvous point, the old bathrooms of Stark's Pond. It was a good spot for spying on the pond. Kyle had to give his friends that much, though he wished they picked somewhere a little less rancid to stake out in. His discomfort was only pushed towards deeper levels when he sensed an ominous shift in the air. The closer they walked towards the darkened woods, the higher Kyle's hair stood on end. His slender fingers gently brushed against the horn bracelet tied around his wrist. "Sure you want to go through with this?" Kenny asked loudly through the sounds of the storm as they came upon the rickety shack of a bathroom. Kyle paused a short moment as if he might be considering, though he ended up nodding his head with resolve. There was obvious doubt in Kenny's eyes. No matter how interesting Cartman's newest escapade seemed, he couldn't shake the feeling that such an adventure wasn't good for Kyle. Not then, when he was already having such trouble healing. "Don't worry, Kenny," Kyle assured with the smallest of smiles. "I can handle it. Besides, when have any of us ever seen Shadow Man? We'll probably just dress up poor Butters and call it a night." Kenny allowed a small frown to break through. Kyle didn't see it as he pulled open the door to the bathroom. Well, it looked more like a shed than a bathroom, both inside and out. The walls were constructed from the tin roof of an old barn. The wooden frame was just the same, and the plywood floor was covered in dirt and filth. Luckily, there were at least stalls shielding their eyes from the horror of the filthy commodes. The first thing they noticed when they stepped into the shady building was Eric Cartman leaning up against the shack-like structure's wooden frame. He was fiddling with a rather expensive-looking camera and didn't bother to look up at the pair as they entered. "Ah, I see you guys decided to show up after all," Eric said. He was trying to sound uncaring, but Kenny caught the small rise of excitement hidden under his droll demeanor. "Good to see you finally found your ball sack, Kyle." "Yeah, whatever," Kyle responded in a mutter. All the spunk the redhead had at lunch had yet again vanished. Eric would just have to pry harder to get a rise out of him, he supposed. "Hey, don't mess around with that," Butter pleaded, as Cartman mindlessly fiddled with the camera. "If you mess it up, oh gosh, I'd be grounded forever." After Butters and Eric were finished bickering, they set to work. The front door was propped open with a large rock so they could keep a lookout, though Butters had to set up the night vision on his father's camera. He was really into photography for a while, Butters explained as he scrolled through a menu on the screen. Though that's all he said before blathering about how scared he was of being caught with it. The night wore on as well as the angry storm. The only sound that cut through its persistent pounding were their own echoing voices. Kyle and Butters lost interest with the stakeout about an hour in. They huddled together in a lump on the nasty floor to watch Eric and Kenny take turns with the camera. No Shadow Man mysteriously appeared to tear up the wet earth, and Eric's frustration was steadily growing. "Well, I guess this isn't going to be as fun as I hoped," he grumbled before passing the camera to Kenny. Kyle and Butters watched through the beams of their flashlight as he made his way towards a backpack propped up on a wooden ledge. With a loud zip, Eric yanked the bag open to proudly reveal his plan B. a large black trench coat. "What do you think, Butters? Does it look about your size?" he questioned with the cock of his brow. "Oh, hamburgers," Butters squeaked. "I don't want to wear that thing. I will never get ungrounded if my parents find out I'm even here. I don't want to know what they'd do if I staged a hoax." Yeah, we're all very concerned," Eric sighed while holding the coat open. "Now get over here." "Holy fucking shit. There's no way," Kenny blurred. "What? What is it?" Eric asked, distracted from Butters. "Holy fucking horse shit." Frustrated, Kyle lurched up off the floor and practically jogged to his friend. Kenny shoveled the camera into his chest and pointed out the door. "Look," he demanded with wide eyes. Before the redhead could even glance into the camera, Butters and Eric were gathered around him to stare at the screen. He pointed it back out the door and slowly scanned the wilderness. Kyle's mouth dropped open in utter disbelief. There in the wind and rain stood a man. He was close enough to the outhouse that Kyle could make out the hood on his head and the long pointed tool at his side. Could this really be it? By some stroke of unfathomable fortune, did they really happen upon the demon of Stark's Pond? The thought made his heart rattle in his chest, like rusted nails in a tin can. "Whoa," Butters whispered shrilly. He jammed his fingers towards the camera's display as if to rub the image in Eric's face. "See? It's him. I told you he was real." Oh, hamburgers. I sure hope he doesn't find us in here." "Find us?" Cartman said with a proud air of determination that made Kyle feel beyond uncomfortable. "It's us who found him. You guys ready?" "Wait, you were fucking serious about catching that thing?" Kyle snapped as harsh wind scraped against their shelter. "We don't know who this guy is, or what the fuck he's doing out there. You got him on tape, that's enough." "We'll find then. I see some of us aren't men enough to see all of this through," Cartman said with a shrug and a sigh. "Well, for anyone who's still got a ball sack, the plan is we take off that hood of his, we get his face on tape, and it's KFC every night for the rest of the year." Kyle believed Eric was overestimating just how much fame and fortune such an encounter would give them. Great plan and all, but what if Shadow Man really is what people say? Or even if he's just a big mean guy in a coat? I don't want to get cut up and buried," Butters tried to reason. He was still watching the camera intensely. His hands gripped at the thing, even though Kyle still hadn't let go. It was hard not to eyeball the massive figure hacking away at the ground. "He's like twice as big as all of us, not to mention he's got a shovel," Kyle muttered in agreement. "Guys, it ran from the guy in the newspaper just 'cause he saw it. We all go after him. We'll catch him for sure. Trust me." That image from the newspaper. It flashed to Kyle's mind and left him feeling woozy. There were orbs littering that image, the tiny souls that were following Shadow Man through the trees. Even if it was the flesh and blood human being, he feared trying to catch it was a crime that would not go unpunished. "Listen, we need to just leave." Kyle didn't have time to finish expressing his blatant doubt. Eric snatched the camera out of Butter's hand and bolted full speed out of the shack door. "Eric, wait!" Butters tried to insist, but the chunky teen was already shuffling across the grass and towards the edge of the woods. By instinct, Kyle and Kenny both jolted up to go after their idiotic friend. They ran out into the storm as Butters trailed behind, shouting about how bad of an idea all this was. Their flashlights shined through the veil of blackness and rain, their boots squished in pockets of mud and cloudy puddles. They could see Cartman's back and the looming creature he was running towards. The massive black figure let out a terrified screech and bolted into the forest at a nearly inhuman speed. Cartman's simple plan quickly mushed together into a terrible mess. The woods were too dark to keep track of everyone. Even their flashlights were good in the violent weather. Kenny ended up in the lead, not even realizing Eric had already ran out of breath and fallen far behind him and the others. Butters was beside the nimble blonde as Kenny hurled himself over tree branches and shrubs to keep up with the retreating monster. Butters, not so nimble. In his effort to keep up, he didn't pay enough attention to where his feet were stomping. Just like that, he lost his footing. Twigs snapped like firecrackers, and he let out a strangled yell as he went tumbling into a thorn bush. God fucking damn it, Butters. Kenny, Kyle, don't let it get away. Go. Go after it, Eric shouted urgently. I'll get Butters. Without a second thought, Kenny kept running. Bewildered, Kyle quickly chased after him. Kenny, no, he tried to reason with a scream. They weaved around trunks of tall trees. As Kenny tried to catch up to the shadow, they could still just barely see retreating into the darkness. However, Kyle's years in track began to show. He proved agile enough to get right up on his friend's tail. He rammed right into him, sending both of them tumbling harshly into the dirt. Are you fucking crazy? Kyle demanded as he stumbled to his feet. Chasing the shadow man through the woods? You've lost your fucking mind. Who knows what that thing is? For God's sake. Dude, look, Kenny whispered. Kyle's infuriated gaze shifted up to a tree. It was just like all the others, really. Thin, tall, and covered in brown bark. However, there was something rather particular that set it apart from the rest. A nail had been driven right through the chest of a teddy bear, pinning it against the bark. There were others as well, stuffed animals, baby dolls, and toy trucks alike, all laid in a heap at its roots. Shit, there is no way that's real, Kenny said, as Kyle stepped forward to get a better look. That's just... wow. Sick. Something was beckoning him to reach out and touch the impaled teddy bear. He couldn't resist. Kyle, don't touch that, holy shit, Kenny shouted before grabbing his friend's hand and walking him a few steps away from the odd thing. We were right. This was a bad idea. Kyle swallowed hard, but the unsettling feeling in his chest was only made worse by the faint rumbling of thunder in the distance. The rain couldn't get them well through the canopy of leaves above them, but the storm wasn't letting up. We'll come back in the daytime to get a better look, okay? Let's get out of here, Kenny muttered. Kyle nodded absent-mindedly, but Kenny had to practically drag him away from the toy-covered tree. They could see the beams of their friends' flashlights through the curtains of woods and leaves. They shined theirs back. The redhead again reached down to fiddle with his bracelet. They walked side by side back down the path they came from. If the swaying trees and flashes of lightning weren't enough to put Kyle on edge, the air had dropped so cold he could feel it seep into his lungs with each breath. His skin was tingling, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood straight up on end. Kenny, do you feel that? Kyle nearly whimpered. When Ken didn't answer, Kyle turned towards him. Aren't you at least? He was stopped dead. His flashlight was shining where Kenny should have been, but all he saw were the trees. No Kenny. No anyone. Kenny? Kyle shouted. His heart was suddenly pounding so hard in his chest, he thought it might explode. Ken? Where are you? Leaves crunched under his boots as he tracked back towards the mysterious tree decorated with toys. He didn't want to go back there, but Kenny couldn't have just vanished into thin air. He had to be somewhere nearby. As he tried to track down their path, he realized nothing looked familiar. The trees and bushes somehow morphed, or he'd wandered onto the wrong trail. He stood still as he tried to work it out in his head. The panic didn't truly set in until he realized he could no longer see Eric and Butters' flashlights through the trees. "Cartman? Butters?" he screamed as loud as he could. He was hoping his friends might yell back, but he was only met with a silence so eerie it left his skull buzzing. There were no chirping crickets or hooting night owls. Not even the yellowing leaves rustled in the wind. In fact, the storm seemed to have vanished, just as Kenny had. The snapping of a single twig cracked through the trees. He shined his flashlight into the foliage. "Kenny?" he questioned softly. There was more rustling. The sound of humming oozed out from between the thin tree trunks and onto Kyle's path. There seemed to be a chorus chiming a quiet tune. The sound of feet scuffing against the autumn ground also bounced around inside his skull. There was only one path that seemed familiar to him, and the voices were dancing on it. He reached to his wrist and rubbed his bracelet for comfort. It gave him the assurance he needed, but his legs still wobbled and his breath became rapid as he turned off his flashlight. He didn't want to go without the light helping to guide him forward, but he didn't want to risk being seen. Stay low. Stay quiet. He pushed past small trees and prickly bushes as he let his thumping chest guide him towards the echoing sounds. It seemed to be coming from every direction. The low branches of a thorn bush grabbed onto his pant leg, digging its sharp edges through the cloth and into him. He hissed and tried to untangle himself with a hard yank. He stumbled over the bush and fell face first into the dirt. Puffing, he wiped his face and gazed up through the tall weeds he'd landed in. The breath was sucked right out of him. Through the grass and ivy, he caught a glimpse of feet, many pairs of small feet. They were nearly impossible to see through the dark of night, but they were there, bouncing playfully. The quiet laughter and unsettling tune he'd heard before were all too clear now. There were children, and they were holding hands. Up to a dozen, maybe. He was too scared to count heads. They were formed into a circle, dancing as they held on to one another. He quieted his breath the best that he could. A mass lurched in the center of their circle. It rose from the ground like a small black hill. What was most unsettling was to watch it shudder. An intense feeling of sorrow enveloped Kyle's being when he watched it try and fail to take a form. Through the ambience of a playground full of happy noise, he heard soft sobbing. The children echoed playful laughter back to the dark form's despaired sounds. It seemed to be trying to join them, trying to play with them. Their song broke away into mush in Kyle's mind. They shuddered and swayed like pictures on an old film, and the thing in the center of their joyful laughter finally rose like a black sheet. Like it was also a child, it swayed with them. He wanted to run away, whatever that thing was starting to take shape. It was very dark, but very human. Its head seemed too heavy for it to hold up. Its movements were slow and lagged like that of a zombie. It stumbled and shook on its own 2 feet, and he found himself thankful it was looking away from him. This was not the shadow man he and his friends chased through the woods. He felt in his gut that it was something far worse. He very slowly got to his feet. His flashlight was still off, Though he was holding it so tightly, his knuckles were turning white. His head was filling with so many pictures. Pictures of faces. Pictures of little boys with light hair and blue eyes. He stepped back and away from the ghostly figures and their play. Much to his horror, he backed into the same thorn bush that tripped him. It rustled loudly, and Kyle's heart stopped when the children's playful noises ceased. His eyes shot up towards the figures. The stumbling zombie of a spirit slowly began to turn its head towards him. A god-awful cracking and snapping resonated from the thing's unsteady spine. Its body didn't budge, but its head kept turning. He faced its grotesque form as he backed away quickly. He didn't want to risk turning his back to the gurgling monster. And, as its head finally turned to face him full on, he realized it was indeed just that. A monster. 2 gaping holes were gouged out of its face where eyes should have been. Black, tar-like grime oozed from the deformities. Its true horror wasn't revealed until the children ran away to hide. With pale, mud-streaked legs, it wobbled towards him. Jagged, long teeth protruded from its wide jaws so wildly it couldn't close its own mouth. Its feet left the ground, but its many, many spider-like arms did not. He let out a horrified shriek when it came barreling towards him. He forced his way through bushes and weeds, all the while trying to keep his feet moving faster than the gurgling beast scrambling for him. The soles of his shoes slammed into the dirt when he made his way back to the path. But he didn't stop running. It was screaming from behind him, and he felt tears of horror brim in his eyes. "Eric, Kenny," he screamed desperately. Kyle shined his light wildly through the trees. He didn't dare to look back. He knew that twisted, shuddering thing was still coming for him. He could hear its knees and hands scraping along the dirt. He fell. His flashlight flew through his hands and smashed into the ground as he was pulled back by his ankle. Screaming and flailing, he kicked at the creature that ensnarled him. The sharp tips of its fingers felt like needles, piercing his flesh through his jeans. "Kenny, help me," he begged as tears streamed down his face. "Please." He kicked it and swore in agony as it clawed at him, as it pulled him closer and closer towards its gaping mouth of sharp teeth. "Stan!" The beast let out a pained cry and quickly fell away. Kyle jumped to his feet and didn't hesitate a moment to run off deeper into the woods. His cheeks were cold from the breeze chilling his tears. His jeans were muddy and ripped, and his hands were in the same shape. All of him was aching down into his core, but he could hear that thing screaming in the distance. He couldn't stop. Through the tears that flew by him, he saw a yellow light. Without a second thought, he sped through thorn bushes and poison ivy towards a structure amidst the trees. It was a house. A single light shined through the back door. He was only a yard away from salvation when he heard the trees rustling violently. He didn't stop when he heard the sickening thump of meat and bone slam into dirt behind him. He didn't stop when he heard those same hands claw away at the ground to get to him. He didn't stop. Not until his feet banged along the rickety porch, and he threw open the door. He turned towards the creature, only for a second to slam the wooden slab in its face. The beast rammed headfirst into the rotting wood. Kyle grabbed a small metal knob and forced the rusted lock closed. The creature was not deterred. It only got more and more angry as it repeatedly rammed the door with its skull. Kyle took a panicked look around. A kitchen. He was standing in a decaying kitchen. He pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking so badly He could hardly press the right buttons. Kenny. Kenny. He needed to call Kenny. Just as he pressed on the familiar name, his screen went black. What? He nearly screamed to himself. What? No. I charged this. Boots thumped against creaking floorboards. They weren't coming from the front porch where the creature was. It came from somewhere within the house, and it just kept coming closer. Fuck, he muttered. Upon the realization that the light he'd seen was a candle, he thought it best to hide. That house was surely condemned. Whoever, or whatever lit that candle, wasn't supposed to be there. The footsteps grew dangerously clear. He quickly scrambled for the counter. Most of the cabinet doors had fallen off or broken. However, there were a few just good enough for a hiding place. He squatted down and quickly climbed into the nasty cupboard. Kyle tried to slow his breathing and remain silent. Peering through the sliver of an opening between cabinet door and wood, he watched an odd scene unfold. The doorknob leading into the kitchen turned and, with a loud creak, came open. There was a man behind it. He was ridiculously tall from what Kyle could tell. His slender body was draped with a pitch-black robe. The black was soiled with mud. The figure's face, however, was too high up for Kyle to see through his loose door. It laid a soiled shovel down on the table across the dingy kitchen. The Shadow Man. While Kyle gawked at the black figure, the disturbing monstrosity that chased him to the house was still heaving itself at the locked door. "You're so loud," the Shadow Man complained in a whisper. It was so quiet, Kyle almost didn't hear it. He watched from his hiding place as the black form ghosted across the room. Without making a sound, Kyle shifted to keep his limited gaze on what was happening. His breath caught when the Shadow Man's black hand slipped open the lock, keeping the beast out. It was then the door busted open with a startling slam. That thing fell inside. Its wild limbs and distorted face slammed against the floor, and the Shadow Man only sighed. "Come here," he said, extending his arm out to the warped mass of flesh. Kyle just couldn't help but think he'd heard that voice before. It was so hauntingly familiar, it scraped shivers up his trembling arms. Kyle watched wide-eyed as long, pale arms grabbed at the Shadow Man's broad shoulders. The creature hoisted itself up onto his body. Bones cracked and ground as it wrapped its legs around his torso. While screaming bloody murder, the horrible beast shuddered up towards the man's face. To help calm the distressed thing in his arms, the tall black mystery phantom sang aloud, whilst bouncing his pint-sized monster like a child. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." The majority of said monster's fingers had been stripped of their flesh, and Kyle watched in horrid fascination as the eyeless beast reached its bones up towards the cloaked man's face. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Its once shrill shrieks were reduced to gentle coos. A face that was plagued by rows of jagged teeth showed nothing of the sorts. Its multiple mangled limbs were gone, leaving behind only 2 arms and 2 legs. However, Kyle could see parts of its face through the crack, and its eyes remained gouged out of its head. "There you go. All better, right?" The tall figure didn't budge an inch. It just allowed the seemingly blind creature to knock off his hood and run its muddy fingers all over his face. The tall man's lips had stopped moving. but his odd companion continued his song in a low, eerie hum. Kyle tried desperately to get a look at the man's face. He squinted and carefully lowered himself down, which eventually granted him a sight that left him rattled with more questions than answers. A crooked nose slathered with smudges of mud, round, blue eyes, and a familiar mop of unruly blonde hair. As the cloaked man, no, boy, turned away, he said a single thing to his mutilated friend that left their eavesdropper's mind buzzing. "Come on, Craig." Despite Kyle's burning curiosity, he laid low and silent. He dared not leave even after the odd pair left the kitchen and shut the door behind them. He stayed, and he waited until he was absolutely sure he would not be caught leaving. The creaky cabinet door was slowly pushed open before he crawled out on his hands and knees. The kitchen floor was covered in dirt and grime. He grimaced as he stood and wiped the mess from his hands onto his jeans. The house was decrepit and falling apart. The wallpaper was peeling away and absolutely everything was covered in dust. He walked calmly out the front door and off of the rickety porch. However, the moment the soles of his shoes hit dirt, he ran as fast as he could. He found that his legs were still shaking, and his breath was heavy and rapid from everything he'd just been through. Still, he found the strength to jog back into the orchid of ominously tall pillars of wood. All the while, he called out for his friends, hoping that they would hear him. He didn't think he had any other chance of rescue. As long as he could avoid the ring of dancing children, he would be content. "Kyle!" he heard someone scream, making him scream. Suddenly, he was lifted off the ground and pulled into someone's arms, though he could only see their orange sleeves in the beam of their flashlight. "Oh, holy shit, I thought we lost you out here," Kenny shouted while squeezing him hard. No, I'm fine," Kyle whispered with his eyes still wide with fright. His feet were back on the ground, but Kenny's hands were still on his shoulders. His friend was not so convinced. Butters and Eric, who were standing behind him, didn't seem to be either. "Oh man, Kyle, you're shaking like a darn leaf," Butters said as he came quickly to his friend's side. "What happened out there?" Kyle shook his head to dismiss the question, though he didn't take another step. He let himself lean against Kenny, all the while still trembling from both fear and the nipping cold. A hand wiped its chilly skin under his nose. Surprised, he looked up. A red blotch was smudged on Kenny's finger. "Your nose is bleeding pretty bad. We're gonna take you home, okay?" Kyle could only wordlessly nod. Kenny looked over Kyle's head towards Eric, who had been standing a few feet away. He looked almost guilty, which Kenny felt fit. He pointed a finger in the chunky teen's direction. "No more of your schemes," he barked loudly. "Ever." Eric didn't say anything as the group shifted and began to make their way back towards the pond. He only grumbled to himself in frustration. Honestly, nothing had really gone according to plan. He was hoping to get a few laughs in with Kenny, to see a glimpse of the Kyle he knew before the crash. Not only did Kyle get lost in the woods, which sparked a screaming match between himself and Kenny, but the footage they captured was fucking useless. Despite night vision having been on, this video was nothing but a solid black screen accompanied by broken sounds. The damn fucking shit camera must have been busted. At the head of the group, Kyle watched his and Kenny's feet step on the yellow and orange leaves. They were wet and covered in brown sludge thanks to the storm. Still, the sight somehow helped him slowly recover. "Kenny?" he whispered carefully. Yeah? What do you remember about Craig Tucker?